Welcome back to a little bit of philosophy. This is Philosophy 101, Unit 2, Lecture 1, Part 2, a very brief introduction to epistemology. In the previous video, we introduced epistemology and academic philosophy as the investigation of problems surrounding knowledge. We've already introduced the three basic questions of epistemology, as well as suggested some preliminary answers to each. In this video, we'll look at those answers in more detail. We've already discovered the working definition of knowledge to be true justified belief, but we defined one word using three other words, so it's probably worthwhile to make sure we understand each of them. Let's start with belief. When we look inside our minds, we find a whole variety of what I like to call thinky things, mental events, or if we really want to get precise, cognitions. We find beliefs, intuitions, thoughts, memories, knowledge, intuitions, all kinds of thinky things. But clearly, not all of these mental events are of the same kind. So let's try to narrow down the meaning of the word belief by considering two pairs of words. First, consider the words intuition and hunch. These words seem to be synonymous in that we can replace one with the other without any loss of meaning. For example, suppose I were to say, I have a hunch it's going to rain today. We can replace the word hunch with intuition and mean exactly the same thing. I have an intuition that it's going to rain today. These words seem to refer to the same kind of mental event. The two words are synonymous. Now consider this second pair. They too seem to be synonymous with each other in that we can exchange them without any apparent loss of meaning. But now consider the two pairs together. The first pair is not synonymous with the second. If I say, I have a hunch it will rain, that's not the same thing as saying, I'm of the opinion that it will rain. What's the difference, you ask? Well, you would never think to ask the question why after the first statement, but you would certainly ask it after the second. If I'm of the opinion that, or if I hold the belief that, you logically want to know why. This tells us something extremely important about the difference between these two different cognitive states. The first is unjustifiable, while the second is justifiable. There is no rational explanation I can offer for having a hunch. I just have one. All I can do is to report that I'm in that particular cognitive state. But when it comes to opinion or belief, we expect to be offered some justification for that mental state. They're both thinky things, but they differ in their justifiability. Another way of putting it is, opinion is stronger than intuition. We take it more seriously, precisely because we can offer at least some evidence for holding the belief. So, from an epistemological point of view, we can define belief or opinion as a higher order cognition that is justifiable, but not yet certain. What all this reveals is that opining or believing isn't binary. It's not that we believe or don't believe, even though we often talk that way. It's actually a matter of degree. We can visualize this with a continuum of justification representing more and less evidence. On one end of the spectrum, we have intuition, and on the other, knowledge. Intuitions are unjustifiable, which is why we don't expect someone to offer an explanation of a hunch they're having. Knowledge, on the other hand, is completely justified. In order to count as knowledge, something must have already been justified to the point that it is no longer in question. Everything that falls between intuition and knowledge is the realm of opinion. Now, a couple of things should jump out to you while we consider this spectrum. First, we probably know very, very little. For something to be knowledge, it must be completely justified, meaning that it can't be wrong. It is no longer open for discussion. Or another way of putting it is, knowledge can never be false. If something we thought we knew turned out to be false, then it was never knowledge at all. Second, and this is perhaps an even more important point, beliefs are not necessarily equal in their justification. Some beliefs will have very little evidence, so that they should be held weakly. Others could be much stronger, even bordering on knowledge, so they should be held much more strongly. Just because something is an opinion doesn't mean that it is just as strong as another opinion. What makes an opinion strong or weak is the amount of evidence we can offer for the belief. While it's certainly true that constitutionally you're free to believe whatever you want, that doesn't mean, however, that you should believe whatever you want. Reason is a much harsher mistress than the Constitution. From the government's point of view, you're free to believe that the moon is made of green cheese if you want to. But reason says that you should not hold a belief more strongly than the evidence allows. So don't confuse someone's right to hold an opinion with the reliability or rationality of that opinion. Opinions require justification, and the more justification you have, the stronger the opinion should be. Having clarified what we mean by belief or opinion, we can now look more closely at the second necessary condition of knowledge, which is truth. We've already seen in our examination of John Locke back in Unit 1 that when philosophers use the word truth, they just mean however the world turns out to be. There's nothing mystical about the truth. It's just a term to refer to the universe. The world is the truth. Not what you think it is, not what you want it to be, but what it actually turns out to be. Our beliefs are true just in case they match how the universe is, and they're false if they fail to match the world. Now, you're probably wondering how we're supposed to know if our beliefs match how the world is, and that's our third criterion of knowledge. In our formula of knowledge as true justified belief, justification is the hard part. This is the rational explanation of why the beliefs in our mind correspond to the world. It's the logos, the argument, the rational story that shows why my cognitions match up with how the world is. But how do we do that? How do we show that our thinky things actually match how the world really is? It turns out that there are two very different approaches to offering justification for our beliefs. One will look inward at the beliefs themselves, and the other will look outward to where the beliefs came from. Internalism is the approach to belief justification that holds that a belief can be justified if it stands in the right relationship to other beliefs in our mind. Internalism is an introspective approach to discovering if our beliefs are true. But philosophers differ on how our beliefs should relate to one another, so we end up with two different internalist theories of belief justification. The traditional view is called foundationalism, and as the name suggests, it requires a foundation upon which belief justification can rest. It begins with a set of terminal or self-justifying beliefs that are supposed to provide a foundation upon which other beliefs can ultimately rest. The key to understanding foundationalism is to understand that some beliefs are supposed to be so obviously true that they require no justification for themselves. That's why they form the foundation. We can see this modeled in the mind of stick figure person. The green beliefs are self-justifying. The red beliefs must be derived from this foundation in order to have justification. So suppose we asked if this belief in their mind was justified. The foundationalist would ask, well, is this belief grounded on another belief? In this case, we see that it is. And that one, in turn, is justified by this belief. And ultimately, we discover that the chain of justification terminates with a foundational belief. Since this one is self-justifying, it lends its credibility up the chain so long as the others are properly aligned with it. Foundational beliefs offer their support to other beliefs in the justificatory chain. But what about this belief? It too is internal to our belief set, and when we examine it, we find that it's derived from another belief, which, in turn, is derived from yet another belief. However, when we inspect this belief, we find that it is terminal in the chain of this set of beliefs, but it does not rely upon a self-justifying belief. This one cannot properly be terminal in the justificatory process. So we can say that while we have some justification for the first belief, but since the justification chain does not end with a self-justifying belief, we have incomplete justification, and a good dose of skepticism would be called for regarding all three. Now consider this belief. Here we find a belief in our network that has no justificatory relationship with other beliefs in the system, let alone with a foundational belief. This would be a completely unjustified belief. I can offer no justification for it. And since it's not self-evident, it would be irrational for me to entertain the belief. I should probably get rid of it, or at least consider it to be no more than an intuition. Now, of course, it could turn out that that belief is true. That's not the question. The question is, do I have reasons to believe it's true? And in this case, I don't. So, foundationalism not only looks to the internal relationship between our beliefs, it's looking for a very specific kind of relationship. If this model reminds you of geometry, it should. Geometry operates on a foundationalist model of justification. You start with a foundation of axioms, then derive other propositions based on those self-evident propositions. But what if you're dubious of there being any beliefs that are self-justifying? What if you want to know why you should accept those foundational beliefs as true? If that seems like a reasonable question, but you still think justification depends on the relationship between the beliefs in your mind, you might prefer the second internalist approach, coherentism. Coherentism and coherentists agree with the foundationalists that justification flows from the logical relationship between our beliefs. They just don't accept that any particular beliefs can stand on its own. Coherentists, in other words, reject the hypothesis of self-justifying beliefs. While there may be trivially true propositions like tautologies, they aren't very useful in generating a body of justified beliefs about the world. Instead, they look to the overall degree of coherence, hence the name of the view, within our belief system as a whole. The more interconnected or the more logical coherence our beliefs have, the more justification we have for our beliefs. From this point of view, the goal is to achieve as much coherence as possible between our beliefs, forming an interconnected network of beliefs, or a noetic web. But wouldn't it be possible to have a coherent set of false beliefs? After all, good fiction requires that a story make sense, that it be coherent, but that doesn't mean that it has to be true. So, even if we had a coherent set of beliefs, how does that get us knowledge if knowledge is true justified belief? Knowledge requires that the beliefs be true, not merely coherent. Of course, a coherentist might reply that coherence itself is a feature of the world, so the more coherence there is amongst our beliefs, the more likely they are to be true. But this seems to be rather weak regarding the reliability of our beliefs if our goal is actually knowledge. We want a stronger argument, a stronger connection between coherence and truth. But there's another objection that relates to both forms of internalism. If a system of justification is supposed to demonstrate the connections between our beliefs and the world, how can either foundationalism or coherentism fit the bill? Both systems purport to tell us about the proper relationships between beliefs in our mind, but why should that tell us anything about the world outside of our mind? This is the kind of objection externalism makes of both forms of internalism. What we need in a system of justification is a clear connection between what's going on inside our mind and what's going on out there in the world. So perhaps the internalist's emphasis on the logical relationships between beliefs is getting the cart before the horse. Perhaps justification should begin with an explanation of how beliefs are formed in the first place. How does information in the outside world get turned into thinky things? What's an appropriate process for belief formation? As you might imagine, this approach to justification is going to prioritize our sensory organs and perceptual neural systems. If we can demonstrate how objects and events in the world cause perceptions in our mind, we can more clearly link belief formation to the objective world. There will be some conditions, internally and externally, that will be more favorable to accurate perception. Ensuring we formulate beliefs about the world under ideal observational conditions will serve to provide more accurate beliefs about the world. Having adequate lighting and proximity for visual perception, for example, will enhance the likelihood of accurate belief formation about the world. Trying to formulate accurate beliefs about the world while intoxicated or hallucinating, or even just while being tired, could interrupt the accurate flow of information from the world to our minds. Hence, those would not be reliable belief-forming processes. Those are circumstances to be avoided if we want accurate beliefs. Now, you might have already made a connection between the internalist and externalist approach to belief justification and rationalism and empiricism as theories of knowledge acquisition. It is true that, generally speaking, rationalists prefer the internalist approach and empiricists tend to prefer the externalist approach. However, even René Descartes, the most famous modern rationalist, places great emphasis on ensuring adequate conditions for observational beliefs. And John Locke, the most famous modern empiricist, shies away from tackling the problem of explaining the neurological processes of belief formation. So it would be inaccurate to draw a strict parallel between rationalism and internalism, or empiricism and externalism. But as a generalization, those relationships would not be inaccurate. Having explored the three necessary conditions for knowledge more closely, we're now ready to turn to our second basic question of epistemology for closer inspection. Initially, we said that there were two answers to the question, can we have knowledge? But on closer inspection, there are actually three different answers that we're going to have to consider. We've already introduced dogmatism and skepticism as the optimistic and pessimistic options regarding the possibility of acquiring knowledge. We've also noted that neither of these positions were absolute, but rather allow for nuance. We're going to explore that in more detail in just a sec. But there's a third possible position regarding the possibility of knowledge, a rather radical answer that will require some careful explanation. That position is what we call epistemic relativism. But let's begin with dogmatism, the view that knowledge is possible. Remember that in epistemology, dogmatism just refers to those who think that knowledge is possible, that we're capable of achieving knowledge. It does not imply dogmatism in the theological sense of holding a belief absolutely or without scrutiny. In philosophy, beliefs require rational justification. They require argument. So dogmatism in epistemology is the general position that it is possible for humans, regardless of our limitations, to achieve true justified belief. But how much can we know? Here, dogmatists vary significantly from one another. We can actually imagine a continuum of dogmatism from the extreme view that everyone already knows everything there is to know, to the most moderate view that there's at least one person who knows at least one thing. As with most continuums, few people fall to the extremes, and we find the majority occupying the middle ground. But it is important to recognize that we can find advocates for a multitude of positions that would fall all along this designation of dogmatism. The same is going to hold true for skepticism. Extreme skeptics would claim that knowledge is impossible, that no matter what belief we're considering, it is possible for that belief to be false. But that's a radical view, and very few people will hold it. At the opposite extreme, we might find someone who believes that knowledge, while possible, doesn't actually exist. That is, no one actually has any knowledge. Again, this is worlds away from extreme skepticism, but it would still fall within the category of the skeptical position regarding knowledge. No one actually has any knowledge. But notice how moderate skepticism and moderate dogmatism are very closely related to each other. The former, holding that no one actually knows anything, the latter, that there's at least one person that knows at least one thing. The difference between these views is very subtle, and this shows us that dogmatism and skepticism actually form a single continuum. On one end, we find the radical position that everyone knows everything, and on the other, that no one can know anything. In the middle, we find the moderate views, and most people are going to fall toward the mean as opposed to the extremes. Some will be a little bit more skeptical, others a little more dogmatic, but we will find very few people who are going to advocate for the extreme positions, even though we must acknowledge them as logically possible. Now that we've got a better grasp of the relationship between dogmatism and skepticism, we can turn our attention to the third possible answer to the question, can we have knowledge? This is the view called Epistemic Relativism, and it is a truly strange view, although lots of people seem to think it might be true. To understand relativism, we must understand its core hypothesis. Truth is relative. Of course, when we ask the obvious question, relative to who, we once again discover that this is not a single view, but rather a continuum of views. Extreme relativism, also known as subjectivism, claims that the truth is relative to the individual. More moderate forms of relativism, also known as conventionalism, would claim that the truth is relative to some group or some context. But no matter where we land on the continuum of relativism, we will find a very strange position, and just a little reflection will demonstrate just how strange a view this really is. You've no doubt heard someone say something like, "That may be true for you, but it's not true for me." Now, if such a person really means what they're saying, this is an expression of subjectivism. The truth is relative to me. You have your truth, I have mine, you live in your universe, and I live in my universe. But given how we've defined the truth, this position will lead to absurd conclusions. If I believe that something is the case, and you believe that it isn't the case, then it both is and isn't the case at the same time. But that's a contradiction, and everything and anything will follow from a contradiction. On the other hand, if the truth just is whatever is, and if both you and I exist, then we are both part of the same universe, the same set of everything that is. And the same things will therefore be true for both of us. What the subjectivist is really claiming is that there is no truth beyond what the individual believes. Each individual thinker is creating the universe, and there is nothing more to the universe than what they think. Another way of putting it is, the universe only exists as an extension of the individual's thought. The subjectivist is totally alone in the universe because they are the universe. Now, if subjectivism seems like a crazy view, it turns out conventionalism isn't going to fare much better. The only difference between extreme and moderate relativism is the subject to whom the truth is relative. But the problem remains the same. The world just is the way it is, regardless of what we think it is. The truth is objective. It is the world, and the world is the truth. Now, it is certainly true that the world may appear differently to different people. In fact, it must appear differently, as we each have different perspectives in time and space, let alone history, culture, sex, species, and a whole host of other differences that are all facts of the universe. So while our perspectives will be different from one another, that doesn't alter what we have a perspective on. Our beliefs don't form the world. Our beliefs are cognitions about the world. And they are either more or less accurate in representing the world. But the world remains what it is independently of our thoughts about it. So, epistemic relativism, in all of its forms, is an absurd position, unless we're willing to deny the existence of an external universe altogether. But someone might object, then how do I know what the universe is really like? But that question brings us right back to the beginning. Epistemology is the philosophical attempt to figure out how to know things. To jump from, I don't know how the world is, or it's difficult to know how the world is, to say there is no way the world is, just doesn't follow. Skepticism and relativism are fundamentally different views in epistemology. The skeptic doesn't deny the existence of the world, they just don't believe we can know how it actually is. That's very different from denying that there is a world out there at all. Now, we've covered a lot of territory in these two short videos, so a full recap will be very useful. We've defined epistemology as the philosophical inquiry into the nature of knowledge. The first question we must answer, if we're going to make any progress at all, is what do we mean by knowledge? We've discovered that knowledge is a cognitive state that is composed of at least three essential components: beliefs, which are true and for which we can provide an adequate rational justification to demonstrate their truth. But there's some dispute about how we go about justifying our beliefs, moving them from the realm of opinion to the realm of certainty. The two main approaches are either to look for some internal feature of our belief system, which we label internalism, or we look to the connection between the causes of our beliefs and the mechanisms that explain how they're formed in the first place. That's externalism. Internalism, the more traditional approach to belief justification, further divides into two different positions: foundationalism and coherentism. The only real difference between these views is whether or not there are any beliefs that can be truly self-justifying, and thereby provide a justification foundation for our other beliefs. Our second basic question was, can we have knowledge? This is where we encounter the problem of skepticism. Is it possible, given human limitations, to acquire knowledge? Here we discover three possible answers: yes, no, and, well, definitely yes. The dogmatists believe that it is possible to provide adequate justification to arrive at true justified belief. The skeptics disagree, claiming that none of our attempts to provide sufficient justification work. The third position, epistemic relativism, is the real anomaly. Since relativism denies the existence of objective reality, what is true becomes relative to some individual or group. But denying reality leads to all kinds of logical problems, so the less said about relativism, the better. Finally, we come to our third question. How do we get knowledge? For those who are optimistic about our ability to acquire knowledge, they owe us an explanation of exactly how we can get it. The two main dogmatic theories are rationalism and empiricism. The rationalists believe in the existence of some innate ideas upon which acquired ideas must ultimately rest. The empiricists deny the existence of innate ideas and generally believe that acquired ideas can be justified through some process of identifying reliable belief-forming processes. In closing, it should be noted that some empiricists, like David Hume, will ultimately conclude that while we only have empirically acquired beliefs, we will never be able to bridge the gap between our internal mental states and the objective world. Hence, empiricism ultimately leads us back to skepticism regarding a posteriori knowledge. What we've tried to cover in these two short videos are some of the basic concepts of epistemology in academic philosophy. But this is only a beginning. If you've already studied academic philosophy or done some reading in epistemology, you might be thinking we've left all sorts of things out, but we've got to start somewhere. And I hope that this introduction to epistemology at least sets the stage for you to investigate more. We'll be going deeper in upcoming videos as we delve into individual philosophers and their views on epistemology. So come back again for more as we learn a little bit of philosophy.